welcome back to Combat Mission, where we are going to take a look at the T-62. It's a core component of the Soviet and Syrian tank fleets in Cold War and Shock Force. In the first, it's a peer threat to NATO forces. In the second, it's a sub-peer threat if you're being polite, and a 40-turn exploding speed bump if you're not. In a lot of ways, and to grossly oversimplify, the development of the T-62 is similar to that of the M60. The predecessors of both, the T-54-55 and the M47-48 respectively, were both immediate post-World War II designs that were soon deemed to be undergunned. Although more advanced projects were in development, what would become the T-64 for the Soviets and eventually the M1 Abrams for the Americans, the time and risk involved in creating new designs with new technologies were too much for military forces that saw a dangerous capability gap they needed to fill quickly and reliably. So the resulting T-62 and M60 were both iterative designs building on the established T-55 and M48. As such, the T-62 physically resembles the T-55 and uses a lot of the same components, including the same engine. The main improvement is the replacement of the T-55's D10T 100mm rifled gun with the 115mm 2A20 smoothbore gun. This was the first smoothbore cannon fitted to a mass-produced tank, starting a trend that has continued to the present day. This was a bigger weapon than the 100mm gun, requiring a larger turret and an elongated hull. The T-62 entered production in 1961, and the last Soviet-built ones rolled off the lines in 1975. Production continued in Czechoslovakia, and some tanks were even built in North Korea, with something in the region of 22,700 T-62s being built in total. During the tank's heyday, it only saw combat service with the USSR against China, in the 1969 Sino-Soviet border conflict, with one tank being disabled, captured and copied by the Chinese to form the basis of the Type 69, and during Soviet operations in Afghanistan. By the mid-1970s, the T-62 was being replaced in Soviet inventory by the T-72, freeing up large numbers for export. As a result, T-62s found their way into tank inventories around the world, but primarily in the Middle East. There, T-62s saw much more of the high-tempo conventional combat service they were designed for than they ever would with the Soviets. To some extent, this makes it very difficult to distill the T-62's combat effectiveness from the new contexts it found itself fighting in. Designed to fight in Europe with Soviet crews under Soviet doctrine, the performance of the T-62 against Israeli or Iranian Centurions and M60s, or for that matter, Libyan T-62s against ATGM armed pickup trucks in Chad, is hard to separate from the performance of Egyptian, Syrian, Iraqi and Libyan tankers and the military systems they fought in. Despite that, it's clear that the T-62 has struggled to compete with more modern MBTs. In the Gulf War and then the 2003 invasion of Iraq, Iraqi T-62s were significantly outclassed by NATO tanks and suffered wildly disproportionate losses. But T-62s remain in the tank fleets of states around the world, and are in fact currently seeing combat service with the Russian army in Ukraine. The design may be 60 years old at this point, and they may be functionally obsolete, but they are still tanks. And while they may not be able to compete against modern anti-tank weaponry, situations will continue to exist where the enemy does not have access to those kinds of systems, and the ability to roll up a 115mm gun and start blasting will still be useful. That's a very quick overview of the history behind the T-62. What are we looking at in a combat mission context? There are currently 4 T-62 variants: the Cold War vintage T-62 1972 and T-62 1975, and the modernised T-62M and T-62NV. We're going to be using the T-62 1972 as our baseline here. Starting off with mobility, the usual caveats around difficulties quantifying apply, but we can now run the T-62 through the vehicle mobility course and generate a standardised score we can use for comparisons. the T-62 1972, got a total of 751 points, which on the surface puts it behind the M60A1 Rise Passive, which scored 653. But almost the entire difference came from the two tanks' performance in the slalom. The T-62 did noticeably worse in the turns, so we can perhaps say it's a bit less manoeuvrable than the M60. If we take the slalom out, the scores become 424 to 429, making the two tanks very comparable. As the T-62's main Cold War opposition, continuing to square off against the M60 makes sense as we start to look at firepower. The 115mm main gun can penetrate the M60's frontal armour with both heat and AP-FSDS ammunition out to 2,000 meters. The AP-FSDS round isn't specified in the manual, but for people who like to know these things, the heat round is the 3BK4M. The tank also carries high explosive shells and, in fact, is loaded with them preferentially to anti-tank ammunition in order to engage in suppressive fire when close with the enemy. The T-62 carries 22 HE, 6 heat and 12 AP-FSDS rounds in total. One notable feature of the 115mm gun is that it has an automatic case ejection system. After a round is fired, this chucks the empty case out through a hatch in the back of the turret. It's mostly a space-saving measure. The T-62 doesn't have a lot of room in the turret for big empty cases to be rolling around in, but it has the significant disadvantage of requiring the gun to assume a specific elevation. Because the gunner's sight is linked to the gun, this means that the gunner will have to reacquire his target after every shot. The tank is also armed with a coaxial PKT machine gun firing 7.62x54R rounds from 250 round box magazines with over 2,000 rounds in total. As usual with this kind of MG, being mounted on a huge stable platform means it has a long maximum range, but a realistic effective range would be more like 800 meters. Finally, the T-62 mounts a Dushka heavy machine gun on the loader's hatch. This is primarily an anti-aircraft or anti-helicopter weapon, but can be used in-game with the target light command. Ammunition is 12.7mm armor-piercing incendiary, fed from 50 round box magazines, of which the tank carries 6 for a total of 300 rounds. Worth remembering is that the Dushka is not remotely operated, and the loader will have to open up to fire it, during which time he is simultaneously vulnerable and not serving the 115mm gun. In terms of armor protection, the T-62 is more heavily armored than the T-55, but still vulnerable in its frontal arc to the M60A1's is likely to be facing down. The A1's M456A1 heat and M728 APDS ammunition will poke holes in the T-62 at a range of 2,000 meters. Later, more powerful 105mm ammunition from the M60 will obviously perform even better. ATGMs and infantry AT are also effective. TOW, Dragon and the M72 Law can all penetrate the T-62 from the front. The tank doesn't have any significant crew survivability features to it. That's normal for tanks of this period, but how many tankers get out of your T-62s when they get hit is going to vary a lot depending on exactly where they suffer penetrations. One problem area in particular is the front right of the hull, which contains an ammo rack for the main gun. Finally, we can do a quick virtual walk around to cover all the other features of the T-62 1972. Starting off looking from the side, the quick way to tell the T-62 from the similar T-55 is to look at the road wheels. The T-55s are all equally spaced out, while the T-62's rear two wheels have a wider separation than the front three. This is to support the elongated hull, which is also evident from the longer engine deck. Coming round to the front of the tank, we have a headlight assembly on the front right of the hull. Behind this is that ammo rack full of 115mm rounds. Next to that, on the front left of the hull, we've got the driver, who has to do his job through two viewing prisms, not much different from those installed on T-34s, although he does benefit from a night vision scope. Moving up to the turret, on the main gun's right, we have the coaxial MG port and an IR searchlight. Behind them is the loader. He has his own hatch with a Dushka mount and a single periscope. To the main gun's left, we have the gunner's primary sight. Obviously the gunner sits behind that. The sight element sticking up next to the aerial there is the T-62's night optic. Behind the gunner sits the tank commander. He has a pretty flat cupola with 5 narrow periscopes. The central one is also a night sight. The lamp on top can be fitted with an IR filter to provide active illumination. Finally, on the rear of the turret, we have some handrails for tank riders, which really show the T-62's age. The long tube underneath is the tank's stowed snorkeling apparatus, which is non-functional in combat mission, and the central hatch at the back there is for the auto ejection system. There are 2 points to note with all of this. First, that although the driver, gunner and commander all have night vision equipment, this is all active rather than passive equipment. Active systems rely on infrared light for illumination, so shining the IR spotlight about will give your position away against anyone who also has IR equipment. In practical combat mission terms, night fighting capability is difficult to measure, and in the Cold War context everyone is in the same boat until passive image intensification equipment and thermal optics enter the game. Secondly, and critically, the size, quantity and quality of optics on the T-62 are all very much inferior to those on the M60. It is a lot harder to see out of, limiting situational awareness and spotting ability. That is a big deal. The key deciding factor in tank combat as a rule is that the side that spots first wins the combat. That's a quick once over of the base T-62 in combat mission, the T-62 1972. There is one more variant in combat mission Cold War, then another 2 more modern variants in Shock Force. The first of these is the T-62 1975. This has an improved fire control system incorporating a laser rangefinder mounted on top of the main gun, which makes it easy to identify. It also replaces the 3BK4M heat rounds with improved 3BK15M heat rounds. And that's about it. A very simple upgrade from a combat mission perspective. The T-62M, as operated by the Syrian Army in Shock Force, has seen more extensive upgrades, which you would expect after almost 40 years. Most obviously, the T-62M has some applique armour. Nicknamed Illich's eyebrows after Leonid Brezhnev's eyebrows, these are composite armour blocks mounted on the turret cheeks. They offer some protection against lighter modern anti-tank weapons such as AT-4s, but obviously only to the front of the turret, and they don't seem to do much against modern APF-SDS. Less obviously, the T-62 features an upgraded fire control system which allows it to fire the barrel-launched AT-12 Swinger ATGM. This is a laser beam riding missile with a range of 4,000 meters, which was rolled out in 1981. By Shock Force's 2008, they are struggling to penetrate the frontal armour of NATO MBTs. This is true for all the T-62's ammunition. The exact types of round aren't specified, but everything is going to need to get flanking or rear shots into NATO tanks. The main advantage of the AT-12 is the extended effective range, but this is generally not that useful on combat mission maps, and the main impact of the ATGM is to eat into the T-62's ammunition supply. T-62Ms still carry 22 high explosive rounds, but only 4 heat and 9 APF-SDS to make room for 5 missiles. Finally, the T-62M is fitted with smoke launchers. These aren't modelled for some reason, but they're there, and they will fire non-thermal blocking smoke about 100 meters in front of the turret. The final variant is the T-62MV. This is simply a T-62M with Contact 1 explosive reactive armour plastered over the front of the turret and the front and sides of the hull. This offers some protection from single-charge heat warheads, but anti-tank technology has moved on since Contact 1 was developed, and anti-tank weapons with tandem charge warheads or top attack profiles are common enough in NATO arsenals to make era protection in Shock Force a lot less useful. Plus, obviously there are large sections of the tank not covered by ERA blocks, and once a block is activated successfully, it leaves a gap in the protection. So, that's all the variants dealt with. What are the tactical implications of all these details? At least in combat mission, I would consider the Achilles heel of the T-62 to be its poor spotting capability relative to what it's going up against. It compares totally evenly to the M60 in almost every other variable. They have basically the same mobility scores from the test, and they can both knock the other out at long range. But the M60 has more better optics, so in a straight up fight, it's more likely to spot first, shoot first, hit first, and kill first. In theory, at the tactical level, the poor spotting capability of the T-62 is mitigated or cancelled out by simply having more tanks at the decisive point. If a single tank has a 20% chance of spotting a target, a company of 10 tanks has a 200% chance. The reality is that the combination of battlefield terrain and the dispersion necessary in modern warfare, FM 100-2-1 covering Soviet operations and tactics specifies up to 100 meters between individual tanks, means that achieving those odds is unlikely. As a rule, battles break down into localized, limited engagements simply because the forces on both sides have restricted fields of view. While an overarching engagement might involve a 10-to-1 ratio in favour of the T-62, allowing it to rely on that massed spotting, the sub-engagements that actually decide the results are more likely to involve lower force ratios which compromise that solution to the T-62's poor spotting. This disadvantage only worsens with the introduction of the M60A3, M1 Abrams and Bradley with their thermal imagers. This doesn't mean that the T-62 is useless. The Soviets wouldn't have built 22,000 of them if it didn't fit their requirements, but at the same time, there is some historical precedent for the kind of lopsided kill ratios we might expect between the T-62 and tanks with better spotting capability. Witness battles like the Valley of Tears in 1973. Inevitably, this gets back to questions of whether these kinds of technical tactical problems with Soviet tanks can be counterbalanced by the speed and momentum of Soviet operational level maneuver. I suspect not. But thankfully, the Cold War never went hot, and it will remain an open question. Moving forward to Shock Forces 2008, we have to take into account a different context for the T-62. The main role of the Syrian armed forces is to protect the regime, and the biggest threat to the regime is the Syrian armed forces. As such, we have a quantity-quality pyramid that I've talked about before. Each tier of the Syrian armed forces is outfitted to be able to outclass the tier beneath. The T-62 is perfectly suited for dealing with poorly armed insurgents or rebellious militia units with limited anti-tank capability, while simultaneously being relatively easy pickings for Republican Guard T-72 Turbs Ts and T-90SAs. In the shock force scenario of a NATO invasion of Syria, the T-62 can certainly get its hits in if handled well, especially if able to engage NATO MBTs from the flank or rear or when taking on lighter NATO forces, but NATO units in shock force generally have the tools and the training to deal with T-62s and to do so with total overmatch. Again, this is borne out historically by the T-62's performance in 1991 and 2003. In short, in Combat Mission Cold War I think it's subpar compared to the US tanks it's likely to face because it just doesn't have the spotting. Your mileage may vary with that, it will probably vary even more if we consider whether this is to do with the characteristics of the tank or how they are modelled and the systems that make it work in combat mission. In Shock Force, it's firmly in the sub-peer category with regards to modern NATO forces, which I'm not sure anyone would disagree with. Hope you all enjoyed this quick overview of the T-62, found it interesting. If you'd like to see these videos early and support the channel, you can do so via Patreon and YouTube memberships. Whether you do or not, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.